The thick scent of tuberoses saturates the still air of the funeral home, heavy enough to make breathing feel like work. You stand there, staring at the pale, lifeless face of the person you loved most, the one whose eyelids you gently closed with your own hands as their final breath slipped away. The death certificate has been signed. The lid of the coffin is moments from being sealed. And then, just as the room settles into its rehearsed sorrow, a dry, brittle sound rises from beneath the silk lining. A purplish finger twitches. A hand, stiff and bruised with death, slowly grips the wooden edge. Amid the shrieks and chaos, the corpse sits upright and fixes you with cloudy, unfocused eyes. How long was I asleep? For Keith Reinhardt, it was not a miracle of resurrection. It was the beginning of something far more revolting than death itself. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do here. We upload new stories several times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please hit the subscribe button and turn on all notifications. Also, please gently sneak into the like button's house. Take all the batteries out of their TV remote and hide them in the back of the freezer. Then, just casually walk out of the front door like nothing ever happened. Now, let's get into today's stories. Our story begins in the late 1980s in a small rural American town. Keith Reinhardt was an unremarkable middle-aged man, employed at a machine shop, and living what most would call a quiet, stable family life. Nothing about him stood out until one catastrophic afternoon at work. A multi-ton slab of metal came loose and crashed down, crushing his chest and stopping his heart instantly. Paramedics did everything protocol demanded: defibrillation, repeated shocks, adrenaline injections. The heart monitor offered nothing but a flat, unwavering line. Keith Reinhardt was pronounced dead at the scene. His family collapsed under the weight of it. His wife, Mary, could not reconcile the image of her strong, capable husband with the reality of a body gone cold in a single instant. Keith's remains were transferred to the funeral home for final preparations. For 2 full days in refrigeration, there were no signs of life, no movement, no warmth, no anomaly. But on the morning the funeral was set to take place, the impossible happened. As the embalmer prepared to apply the final touches, he noticed a faint flush returning to the fingertips of the body. Then, before the stunned eyes of everyone present, Keith Reinhardt drew in a deep, ragged breath, his eyes snapping open as air filled his lungs. Doctors later described it as a medical marvel, a rare instance of spontaneous return after clinical death. Keith recovered quickly and returned home to a town that greeted him as something close to a legend. He became a symbol of hope, a man who had stared down death and stepped back across the threshold. But in matters that touch the unknown, revival rarely comes without consequence. Mary was the first to sense that something was wrong. Keith looked the same. He spoke in the same voice, but his eyes were altered. They were colder, emptied of warmth, and at times seemed to look past people, as if focused on something layered behind reality itself. He began talking about friends he had encountered in the darkness while he was gone. He described a realm without light, where wandering spirits murmured the private sins and hidden secrets of the living. At first, people attributed it to trauma, to neurological disturbance after catastrophic injury. Yet what followed forced them to reconsider. Keith developed an unsettling ability. He could predict death. He would stand on a neighbor's porch and say calmly, "Tomorrow, your dog won't bark anymore." And the next morning, the animal would be found dead without explanation. He warned a friend, "Don't go to work on Wednesday. The tracks will split." The friend laughed it off. That Wednesday, a train derailed along the very stretch he traveled each week. The town's admiration curdled into fear. Doors closed when Keith approached. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. They began to call him the messenger of hell. But the worst events unfolded inside Keith's own home. Late at night, Mary began hearing sounds from the basement, scratching against wood, whispering in a language she could not identify, low and layered like several voices speaking at once. Each time she forced herself to investigate, she would find Keith sitting alone in the dark, staring at the stone wall. When she asked what he was doing, his reply came in a hoarse, strained whisper. "They're not finished with me, Mary. They want an exchange." An exchange for what? The question lodged in Mary's mind and would not release her. It followed her through sleepless nights until the terror finally took form. On a moonless night, she awoke to a rush of air so cold it burned her lungs. Keith's side of the bed was empty. A thin trail of blood dotted the hallway floor, leading downward to the basement. There, she found him standing inside a circle drawn in bird's blood. He was no longer the gentleman she had married. His face was contorted, his eyes blazing with a red, unnatural glow. Keith held a knife and carved strange symbols into his own flesh. He claimed that they demanded a life in exchange for his return. Death, he said, does not work without payment. Somewhere between worlds, at the edge of breath and oblivion, he had signed a contract he did not understand. And now the collectors had come. By morning, police were summoned to the Reinhardt residence. Mary was discovered in a state of acute shock. Keith was gone. The basement bore evidence of a violent ritual, blood, markings, overturned objects, but no body. Stranger still, every person whose death Keith had previously foretold suffered severe accidents on that same day. It was as if a delayed chain reaction of mortality had finally been triggered. The search for Keith Reinhardt stretched on for months with no results. He seemed to have dissolved into nothing once again. Yet the story did not end there. Years later, hikers in the surrounding forest occasionally reported seeing a man matching Keith's description wandering among the trees at dusk. He did not speak. He did not smile. He simply stood at a distance, watching with the hollow gaze of someone who no longer belonged to this world. What do you make of the case of Keith Reinhardt? Did he truly return to life? Or was his body merely a vessel for something that slipped through the gates of hell? Perhaps the accident at the machine shop marked a definitive end, and everything that followed was a catastrophic error in the natural order. This story serves as a warning. There are laws woven into existence that are not meant to be broken. When a soul departs, let it depart in peace. Because if it returns, it may carry with it a fragment of darkness we are not prepared to face. Never wish for a miracle from the realm of the dead. The price may be your own soul and the souls of those around you. Keith Reinhardt came back, but he brought hell back with him. And to this day, whenever someone vanishes under unexplained circumstances in that region, the locals murmur the same explanation. Keith must be collecting again. The silence of the deep woods and the whispers that surface at night remain, waiting for those reckless enough to probe what lies beyond. Can you be certain that the person who returned home from the hospital after a near-fatal illness is truly the same individual you once knew? Or did they leave part of themselves in that dark place and bring something else back in its stead? Close your eyes and picture yourself standing on the shore of Analyus on a night in late January 1965. This is not the kind of postcard beach tourists dream about. Tonight, Lebanon is bracing under a violent storm. The waves do not lap gently against the rocks. They crash and roar like some enraged beast. The rain is sharp and icy, needling your skin, and your world shrinks to a few trembling meters beneath the weak, flickering beam of your flashlight. You are a police officer. At your feet lies something that will haunt you for the rest of your life. The body of a man face down in the sand. And most horrifying of all, it has no head. You have been ordered to remain here alone and guard this evidence. But in a moment of exhausted delirium, you make a mistake that cannot be undone. You fall asleep. When you wake, the body is gone. So is your service weapon. What would you do to save your honor and your career? Would you dare to kill a stranger to replace the missing corpse? And if you did, would you be prepared to face the truth that the man you just killed was the murderer, and the body you lost belonged to your own flesh and blood? Our story begins with Fair Jabber, a mild-mannered, middle-aged man struggling to make ends meet as a police officer in the small village of Analyus. Fair is no brilliant detective. He is an ordinary patrolman who loves his job and fears losing the only income his family depends on. That night, when a report came in about a strange object on the beach, Faird and his partner, an older, more seasoned officer, made their way toward the shoreline. Through sheets of rain illuminated by their flashlights, they found the victim. It was a man dressed in clothes soaked with sand and blood, his head severed with brutal precision. In a village as quiet as Antelias, the discovery of a headless corpse was nothing short of a shock. Faird's partner decided to return to the station to file a report and summon forensic investigators, leaving the younger, lower-ranking officer behind at the scene. Faird, your job is to guard this body at all costs. No one and nothing is to move it, the older officer instructed before disappearing into the darkness. Faird remained there alone with death. The wind whistling through the rocks sounded like a mournful wail. He tried to stay alert by pacing back and forth, but the biting cold and the relentless rhythm of the waves began to wear him down. Around 2 a.m, he sat on a large rock to shield himself from the wind, telling himself he would close his eyes for just a few minutes. In that freezing darkness, his body betrayed him. Faird slipped into a deep, dreamless sleep. When the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Faird jolted awake. Instinctively, he looked toward the stretch of sand where the headless body had lain. It was empty. Nothing remained but rain-swept sand and faint impressions already dissolving. The corpse had vanished as if it had never existed. Panic seized him. He checked his belt, and a more horrifying realization struck. His holster was empty. His service pistol, the most essential possession of a police officer, had been taken while he slept beside the dead. In that instant, Faird saw his career, his reputation, and his future collapsing. If the detectives arrived to find an empty crime scene, he would face prison for negligence and for losing his weapon. Driven by desperate panic, he began running along the beach, hoping a powerful wave had dragged the body away. But the storm, for all its fury, had not been strong enough to carry off a corpse. Then, in the distance near a ramshackle fishing hut, Faird spotted a figure. A man was calmly chopping wood. His composure seemed strangely out of place on a night like this. A dark thought took root in Faird's mind, a poisonous instinct for self-preservation. If he killed this man, he could create a new body. He would sever the head, arrange the corpse where the original had lain, and when the investigators arrived, they would see a headless body exactly where it was supposed to be. No one would know the difference. What Faird did not know was that the man chopping wood was no innocent passerby. He was the murderer from the night before. He had returned to the scene, found the officer asleep, and quietly dragged the original body back to his home to dispose of it completely. He had taken Faird's pistol as a trophy. Faird approached, his service dagger trembling in his hand, but his resolve hardening. The stranger turned, startled, but before he could speak, Faird lunged. A brief struggle followed. In a frenzy fueled by terror, Faird killed him. Then he committed the most barbaric act of all. He severed the man's head to recreate the original crime scene. He dragged the new body back to its former position on the beach, scattered sand to conceal fresh bloodstains, and arranged the corpse as closely as possible to what he remembered. By the time the sun rose higher, his partner returned with a team of detectives from Beirut. Faird stood there, pale and soaked, struggling to maintain a composed expression. "The scene is intact," he reported, his voice unsteady. "But life is not so easily staged." One of the most experienced detectives stepped closer to the body and studied the clothing. "Officer Jabber, yesterday this victim was wearing a brown jacket, correct?" Faird nodded quickly. "Then why is this body dressed in a dark blue sweater?" The question struck him like a blow. The inconsistencies did not end there. The blood on the sand was too fresh, too vivid for a body that had supposedly lain in the rain for 6 hours. Under the sharp scrutiny of the investigators, Faird's deception unraveled. During interrogation, he broke down and confessed to killing the stranger in order to replace the missing corpse. But the most devastating truth was still to come. Police searched the home of the man Faird had killed. Beneath the floorboards, in a crude pit, they discovered a gruesome sight. The original headless body and its severed head. When detectives brought the head forward, Ferd let out a cry of anguish before collapsing. The first victim, the man found on the beach, was Habib Jabber, Ferd's closest cousin. Habib had been attacked and robbed of a large sum of money before being dismembered by the very man Ferd had just killed. Consider the bitter irony. Ferd had slain the man who murdered his own cousin. In trying to conceal his failure, he had unknowingly carried out vengeance in the most brutal way possible. He had avenged his kin, yet in doing so transformed himself into a cold-blooded killer. The Lebanese court later convicted Ferd Jabber of premeditated murder. Although the man he killed was a criminal, Ferd's act was not one of self-defense or justice, but one born of selfish fear and cowardice. The story of Ferd Jabber endures as a cautionary tale about the fragile boundary between light and darkness. On a storm-ravaged night, a police officer lost everything: his cousin, his career, his honor, and ultimately his soul. Sometimes, the very lie we cling to in order to save ourselves is the force that drives us most swiftly into ruin. Never underestimate a moment of weakness, and never believe you can outmaneuver fate through cruelty. When you stare at a headless body in the sand, it may belong to someone you love, and the man standing behind you may be the one you are about to become. That's going to do it for today's stories. If you enjoyed this video, please let us know by leaving a comment and telling us what you thought about these cases. Or if you have any theories of your own, I'd love to hear them. Thank you so much for your support, and until next time, we'll see ya.